I was reading a novel recently, and it had a little phrase like, everybody knows that the farther away that an expert comes from, the more reliable they are. And I just thought I'd have to trot that out today. Anyway, so I come from Washington University, which is not here in Washington, D.C., and it's not there in Washington State. It's right in the middle of America, under the Gateway Arch, kind of. Okay, anyway, just so you know where I'm from. I'm not actually going to talk about anything that might be corrupted by associating with pharmaceutical companies, so let me show you a little clip of a movie that some of you may have already seen. Okay.
Well, there it is. Tourette Syndrome is a certain brain defect. It's a neurological problem that I was born with that causes you to tic. Tics control our bodies, kicking like coughing, twitching, like snapping all the time. Do a lot of things people wouldn't like. My mom calls me the mouse because I make a lot of squeaking noise. Shaking my head. Now that I said it, I have to do it. I'm like this, flapping my arms, and everybody thought I was trying to clap. No, you can't help it. It's not contagious. Like if I shook your hand and said I'm in school, you would not get Tourette's. They would come up all the time. Copy! Can you shut up? It's there. Why do you have to make fun of it? Why are you doing that? That's so annoying. Could you please stop? In this thing, I'm a little crazy. The person who has Tourette's isn't like another person. Like I'm a regular kid. If she has green.
All right. Hard to follow cute kids. Okay. So many of you, of course, are more familiar with tics than you want to be, but for those of you who aren't, let me take a few more minutes to describe what we just saw in the video. So tics are unwanted, abnormal movements that people don't want to do. In other words, they are discrete, intermittent, sudden, repetitive, but not rhythmic movements that are stereotyped. In other words, it tends to be the same thing over and over. It's not like, oh, that girl who moves too much, it's that girl who keeps doing X. Tics are suppressible to some extent and are often improved when somebody is absorbed in a task. So like if they're speaking up here, they might not tic as much as if they were sitting in the audience. So I've asked about 100 people with tics, so pick one of these statements. Which one fits you better? Look at that, my arm just moved, or I've got to move my arm. And almost everybody says, I've got to move my arm. So people will say involuntary, but it's not involuntary in the sense of it just happens without me noticing for most people. Although there's a variety of that experience within people with tics and depending on which tic we're talking about. Tics are more common in the head and face and neck and vocal cords than other places, but they can involve any part of the body. And typically, tics will change over time. You know, so like this month, this is my worst tic. Next year, it might be a different one. So for years, tic doctors have tried to separate tics into motor and phonic or vocal tics and simple or complex tics. Because it's partly easier to define tics by examples than it is some other way. The most common tic is probably excessively, squeezy kinds of blinks, I guess is an easy way to say it. Some of the others include sniffing or humming, throat clearing, and so on. Complex tics mean things that involve more than one muscle group or that are more than a simple brief noise. So basically saying words is complex vocal tics, and things like touching things, copying other people, walking in an odd stilted way, those are complex motor tics. In addition, there are other features of tics that don't fit into this pattern very easily. Dystonic tics can be things that are more held for a longer period of time and that look like a fragment of idiopathic dystonia. And many people with tics, including Dr. Gilles de la Tourette talked about sensations that kept coming that people have called sensory tics or premonitory phenomena. And we'll come back to that in a second. All right, another cute kid video here. There's got to be a better way to do that.
Because I'm in control of everything else. Why aren't I in control of that? Why can't I stop myself from doing that? And just for a second, I just feel like kind of funny inside. I said, why can't I stop doing this? Why can't I stop doing this?
I had a tic, like a really loud screeching noise. All the kids would like tell me to stop and just keep staring at me. Stop it! And I would say, I can't.
Certain things trigger tics, like let's say reading orders, I guess. Like every time you come to where pee, you have to jump like on my foot. Like that.
I'm doing it so much that I just betrayed my energy. I can't handle it. I just get tired. It's also embarrassing.
I feel like a marked man, you know? Like people would already know you when they don't.
The hardest thing is probably you can't make friends as easily as someone else who doesn't have Tourette's. People stare. But you know what? You gotta just like let them stare.
Okay. So, so probably the distinction is somewhat arbitrary, but like I said, for a long time people have divided tics into motor tics and vocal or phonic tics. Basically, phonic tics are tics that involve movement of muscles of phonation and respiration, you know, things that like sniffing or grunting or that kind of thing, and words, of course. They're less common as an initial symptom and over the years. There are things that people often don't know are tics until much later, and that send them to other doctors, for instance, that don't see allergies. So like where I live, everybody has allergies. You know, there's a lot of mold and whatever. And so kids that start with a sniffing tic might go to an allergist or their pediatrician. People who blink a lot might be sent to an eye doctor even though they don't have red eyes or itchy eyes. I remember one kid that had long hair and he kept, you know, flinging the hair out of his eyes, and eventually his mom made him cut his hair, and he still flipped his head even though there wasn't hair to flip out of the eyes, you know, things like that. So the famous thing about Tourette's is coprolalia, meaning like basically potty mouth, repeating vulgar or inappropriate words or phrases. And even though, as somebody said the other day, it affects 100%, that was Brad, like 100% of people in movies, it's really only about 1 in 10 people with Tourette in the whole population. All right.
Who's that? Like you can't hold it a sneeze, you can't hold it a cough. You can't hold it a yawn for that's kind of like when I have tics, and that's how hard it is to stop. So it's basically annoying. It's not because I want to. It's just annoying. I just have to.
Okay, do you ever feel like alone or different from everybody else, or do you just feel like anyone else?
I do feel different sometimes. Not all the time. My friends help me keep it nice up in gear.
My name is Julia. I'm in 6th grade, and I'm 12 years old. Like tics, like it's like an itch. Like you have to like scratch it. You just do it. It's like controlling it, and you feel like you have to, or something's gonna happen. When I'm having a bad day, and a lot of tics are coming out, I go really pretty much crazy.
I thought he was going to be retarded. I don't know, he was trying to say something, but it wouldn't come out clear. He would yell out.
When I first met him, I thought that he was purposely doing it, you know, trying to get attention.
The curse words, the bad words, they come out. But sometimes, like, if I'm around people, I try to hide them by, like, going, like making him in a high-pitched voice.
Alrighty, so what you see there is that many, the great majority, at least of adults with tics, will report that the tic is a response that's hard to hold back to an involuntary sensation that just pops up. Sometimes it could be a specific thing like my eye's funny or my throat has something in it. Sometimes it's more of a hard to explain overall feeling like I've got to do something. And in that way, it's kind of like an obsession and a compulsion. Before a compulsion, people almost always have some kind of a worry or a thought or an image in their head that the compulsion is a response to, like my hands are dirty, so I'm going to wash them. With tics, it's different in that it tends to be a physical sensation that comes before the tic rather than a specific concern or worry or image in the head. Tics, one of the things that throws off family members, kids in school, doctors, is that tics are variable. They vary both from month to month, but also in different situations. So like things that are more stressful bring out tics. Situations that are uncomfortable for somebody. Tics are much better during sleep, but they aren't completely gone. And I'm going to skip that for time. So as an example, one former patient of mine said that what you see me doing is not the Tourette. The Tourette is the itch inside that makes me need to scratch it. Now, some of my colleagues say, no, that explanation might make sense, but that's just our brain trying to make sense of things. It's not clear whether the sensations are actually primary or if they're the brain making sense of something that you're doing without wanting to. All right, last cute little kid thing.
There's some kind of traits that people don't know about, and that's called OCD.
Obsessive compulsive disorder. Like thoughts that I can't get off my mind. Just think in my mind like a piece of gum. My mind just says, everything has to be even. I need to do it evenly. If I touch something with one hand, I have to touch it with the other hand like twice or 4 times or 8 times.
Every time I write, if I go to the line or something, I always have to erase it and keep erasing it and make it better because I can't get it out of me. I can wear the eraser out until I was like, write it that metal thing in one day.
Well, I don't like germs. They're gross. Because it's all
I
slimy.
can't play basketball because of like all the people that know my licking their fingers and now they're playing basketball.
Get you infected.
No, like I'm touching the CJ without even touching the CJ, you know?
I think poles, bricks, walls.
Yeah, wash my mouth.
And I just keep doing
This is a weird one. My eyes, if I see something that has a corner, that has a point to it, my eyes will start hurting really bad. Sometimes when I'm watching a movie and I see something in the corner of my eye, I need that to be moved so I can't see it anymore. When I get
So it turns out that most people with tics don't have just tics. In fact, most people that come to a doctor because of and have Tourette's, it's not necessarily the tics that are the most problematic thing. For some people, sure, but not for everybody. And something like about a third to a half of children with Tourette's have OCD, and something like just over a half of people with Tourette's have ADHD symptoms. But there are a lot of other things that come along with tics. One of my colleagues here is going to talk some about rage attacks. Learning disabilities are quite common. School phobia can even be caused by medications, it turns out. Inflexibility, things have to be done exactly my way. In fact, out of a large sample of children with tics who had been to see a doctor at a tertiary referral center, 7 out of 8 of them had something else. And people with, quote, pure Tourette's were rather rare. And that was the same idea was shown in a completely different sample of patients. I'm going to skip this. Okay. So basically, the current definition for what is Tourette syndrome is that you have to have both motor and vocal tics at some point over the course of your illness. They have to start before you attain adulthood, and they can't come like the day after you got poisoned or beaten over the head until you passed out or something like where you think, oh, that's not coming up by itself. And they have to last at least a year from start to end, even if there are gaps in the middle. And if you want a long sentence, there's a long sentence. Okay, tics start on average around age 6 or 7. Some people before, some people after. And the worst time on average for tics in somebody's life is 9 to 11 years old. However, like I had a patient who came and saw me, she'd never seen a doctor before for her tics. She'd had it her whole life and she was in her 70s. That's unusual, but the point is that tics can get worse at any point in life. This is a graph that shows among a sample of children who have tics, in fact, who have Tourette syndrome, at what age are other symptoms likely to start? And so ADHD symptoms often come before the tics even start. Disruptive behavior disorders like ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, often start before the first tic is noticed. But then other problems like OCD tend to start a little bit later, although still in childhood. I won't read all of this, but the point is that I would say a typical person with Tourette, not necessarily a typical person at the doctor's office, but a typical person with Tourette syndrome may not have severe tics. They may be rather mild most of their life with exacerbations at some points in time that make it become a problem. And often the symptoms that bring them to medical attention, like I said, are ADHD symptoms. The problems for people with tics tend to come in terms of social interactions, employment, think of job interviews, or school, where you're supposed to be focusing on something else and instead your brain is focusing on your tics or your OCD or whatever. This is to remind us that in social life, laughter is not always the best medicine. So being teased is a major part of the morbidity that children especially experience. For many people, it's wanting to be focused on one thing, running a race or taking an exam at school, and having the other symptoms interrupt what you're trying to do. OCD symptoms, ADHD symptoms tend to be one of the main reasons that contribute to complications, but also self-injurious tics like hitting yourself can also be a serious problem. Most people with chronic tic disorders do not receive disability income and probably don't need it, but a few may. As far as we've been able to tell, tics are usually not the thing that ends up killing you in the long run. People usually have a normal lifespan, and often in adulthood, tics tend to improve. It used to be thought to be quite rare, and now it's clear that chronic tic disorders are quite common. The estimates that are reasonably accepted are in this range, that maybe 0.5% of children in primary grades have Tourette syndrome, and maybe like 1 in every 30 has some chronic tic disorder. But there are reasons to think that it's even more common than that. Certainly tics that have lasted less than a year when they are noticed on epidemiological surveys are as common as 25 to 50% of children in the age of 5 to 10 years old. But this is a complicated thing. Parents often don't notice tics or don't know that they're tics. Children don't know. Oftentimes their doctors don't see it when you go in for a visit. In fact, and what I think is one of the best epidemiological studies done, I think, in Spain, there were 17% of children in that approximately ages 5 to 12 had a tic disorder. 11% had a chronic motor tic disorder. We know that tics are more common in boys than girls. They happen in pretty much every ethnic or racial group, although there's very little data on whether they're evenly spread across different backgrounds. There are a lot of big questions remaining about tics that I'm not going to mention. I'll just mention one other thing and I'll be done. When someone's trying to find out what to do about Tourette syndrome or whether a child has it, it doesn't require a lot of fancy equipment, brain scans, EEGs and stuff like that, unless there's a specific other problem that suggests itself from the historical information. But you have to learn to know what tics look like, and you have to learn to watch for them when you're not staring at somebody. Because usually if you're looking right at somebody with tics, they're less likely to tic than if you're pretending to look at your computer and keeping your peripheral vision open. A lot of times somebody will bring in little Johnny and say, yeah, he's doing this all the time, and then they look over at little Johnny, he's sitting there peacefully, and it's like, when you take your car to the shop and it won't make that noise, Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. I appreciate your attention.